In the spring of 2026, Liza Minnelli published a memoir about the life she had spent trying to claim as her own. At 79, she was still being asked about the same person who had shaped nearly every part of it, her mother, Judy Garland. The previous August, her sister Lorna had stood inside the Sphere in Las Vegas with her daughter Vanessa, watching a 16-year-old Judy appear across the enormous screen in The Wizard of Oz. Joey Luft, the youngest, chose a quieter way of remembering. He rarely spoke about the darkest parts of their childhood, once saying, "I don't want to talk about the bad things." 3 children. 3 very different ways of carrying the same mother. On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland died in London at the age of 47. Her death was ruled an accidental overdose. The coroner found no evidence that it was intentional. Liza was 23. Lorna was 16. Joey was 14. The world had lost one of its greatest entertainers. They had lost a woman who could fill a theater, disappear behind a bedroom door, make them laugh, and sometimes leave them to become the adults in the room. Liza would spend her life trying to separate herself from the legend. Lorna would tell the painful truth without erasing the love. Joey would remember his mother within boundaries the public could not cross. To understand what Judy Garland left those 3 children, we first have to understand what she never truly had herself. A childhood that belonged to her and a home that stayed in one place. The girl who would become Judy Garland was born Frances Ethel Gum on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Her parents, Frank and Ethel Gum, were both vaudeville performers. Her father ran the local theater, the New Grand. Her mother played piano and managed the acts. The family was not rich and not poor. It was a household built around a stage. Frances was on that stage before she could read. By the time she was 2.5, she was singing Jingle Bells alongside her 2 older sisters at her father's Christmas show. The 3 girls performed as the Gum sisters, and the act was not a hobby. It was a family business. Other children came home from school to a kitchen. Frances came home to a theater. The family moved to Southern California when Frances was still young, to be closer to Hollywood, to be closer to the next opportunity. Her father bought a theater in Lancaster. The sisters kept performing. And by the time Frances was a teenager, the entertainment industry had noticed her voice, not her sisters' voices, not the act as a group, but her specifically, and the machinery that would define the rest of her life began to close around her. Her father died on November 17, 1935. She was 13 years old. That same year, she signed a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The 2 events happened within weeks of each other. She lost a parent who had been her connection to whatever was left of ordinary life, and she entered a system that would replace ordinary life entirely. MGM did not adopt Frances Gum. It manufactured Judy Garland. It gave her a new name, a shooting schedule, a public image, and a set of expectations about how she should look, how much she should weigh, and how many hours she should work. Decades later, her oldest daughter would put it plainly. "You tried growing up at MGM," Liza said. "Horrendous." Multiple biographies and family accounts have linked the studio's control of her schedule, body, rest, and medication to the dependency that followed her into adulthood. She was a teenager inside an industrial system that measured her value in output and treated her physical limits as problems to be managed rather than signals to be respected. In 1939, Judy Garland was 16 years old, and she played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. The film made her immortal, and the song she sang in it, "Over the Rainbow," became the most famous song about home ever recorded. The following year, she received the Academy Juvenile Award. She was 17. This is not the full story of Judy Garland's career. Her career would go on for another 3 decades, through concert halls and comebacks and collapses and 5 marriages, and a special Tony Award at 29 and an Oscar nomination at 32. That story has been told many times. What matters here is narrower. By the time Judy Garland became a mother, 3 times to 3 children by 2 different fathers, she had never experienced a childhood that was not also a job. She had never learned, because no one had taught her, where the performance was supposed to end and the private person was supposed to begin. That was a woman who, in 1946, became a mother for the first time. Judy Garland became a mother for the first time in 1946, when Liza May Minnelli was born. The father was Vincente Minnelli, a director at MGM, the same studio that had built Judy and was still, in many ways, running her life. They had married in 1945. The union was glamorous, industry-connected, and brief. By the time Liza was about 6, her parents had separated. Vincente Minnelli remained a separate presence in Liza's life after the marriage ended. He was a working director with an aesthetic sensibility that shaped how she understood performance, color, and visual storytelling. His household gave Liza another point of reference, another famous parent, another home, another version of what a life inside the entertainment industry could look like. That made her family structure different from the one Lorna and Joey would later experience. That difference mattered because Liza did not grow up inside only one family story. With Judy, life could move according to rehearsals, hotel bookings, medical crises, and emotional weather of the day. With Vincente, the world was still Hollywood, but was organized differently around sets, design, preparation, and the controlled imagination of a director. Liza later spoke affectionately about both parents, even while recognizing that they were profoundly unsuited to each other. She did not need to choose which parent had formed her. Judy gave her the instinct to reach an audience. Vincente helped sharpen her eye for how a performer should look once the audience was watching. By the time she was 3, she had already appeared on screen, carried to the final scene of Judy's 1949 film, In the Good Old Summertime. She did not enter the entertainment world as a teenager making a decision. She was placed inside it before she could walk, because the camera was already there. Then came a different household. In 1952, Judy married Sid Luft, a producer who became her manager and, for a stretch of years, the person who kept the entire operation moving. The bookings, the money, the schedules, and the increasingly complicated logistics of Judy's professional and personal life. Their daughter Lorna was born on November 21st, 1952, in Santa Monica. Their son Joey followed on March 29th, 1955. The marriage to Luft was longer and rougher than the marriage to Minnelli. It was also the period in which Judy's career swung between extremes. Extraordinary live performances that drew standing ovations and financial crises that never fully resolved. Sid was simultaneously husband, father, and business manager, which meant that the children's home life and their mother's professional survival were handled by the same person. When the marriage eventually ended, that arrangement collapsed too. Lorna and Joey did not know the earlier phase of their mother's life that Liza had briefly glimpsed, the younger Hollywood Judy, before the touring and the financial pressure and the dependency became as visible as they later were. By the time Lorna and Joey were old enough to form memories, Judy's life was already organized around the cycle that would define her remaining years. Perform, collapse, recover, perform again. The household moved not according to a family calendar, but according to where the next engagement was, where the next audience was willing to pay, and where the bills were most urgent. Lorna would later describe growing up surrounded by people the rest of the world considered legends. She said she and her siblings did not know their mother's friends were famous. Marilyn Monroe once sat on the edge of her bed watching her sleep, and to Lorna, that was just someone her mother knew. The world of celebrity was not a world she entered. It was the only world she had ever been in. All 3 children appeared on their mother's stages and screens early. Liza had her camera debut at 3. Lorna made her television debut at 11, singing on the Judy Garland show's Christmas episode in 1963. Joey also appeared in Judy's projects. He and Lorna both had small roles in Judy's final film, I Could Go On Singing, released the same year. The children were woven into the work. They traveled with her, performed with her, and sat in the wings while she performed without them. For Lorna and Joey, appearing beside Judy was not yet a declaration that they wanted careers of their own. It was simply what family participation looked like. Other children might be asked to sit quietly while a parent finished work. Judy's children could be brought onto the stage, given a song, placed in a camera frame, and folded into performance itself. The applause was warm, but it also reinforced an old family rule. Closeness happened through work. Liza understood that rule earlier than either of them. She was not only the oldest child, she was the one who could move between being a daughter, a performer, and, when necessary, another adult in the room. Lorna and Joey still had each other, as near equals in age. They shared the same father, the same stretches of touring, and many of the same backstage memories. Liza belonged to that unit too, but often from a slightly different position. Part sister, part witness, and increasingly part protector. And they moved constantly. Liza would later recall that Judy had given her and Joey a choice: stay in Los Angeles and go to school, or come on the road. They chose the road. Liza said she personally attended 22 schools before she was done. That number says more about the shape of her childhood than any description of the homes they lived in, because the homes kept changing. The one constant was their mother, her voice, her energy, her unpredictability, and the fact that wherever she went, her children were expected to go too. The three siblings did not experience this identically, and the differences between them started early. Liza, as the eldest and the only child of Vincente Minnelli, had a separate anchor, a father with his own household, his own career, his own stability. Lorna and Joey had each other, and Sid, whose role in the family was entangled with Judy's career in ways that made it difficult to separate the personal from the professional. When things were working, Sid kept the family solvent. When they were not, the children felt it directly. What none of them fully understood at the time was that the household they were living inside was built on Judy's ability to keep performing. When she performed, there was money, attention, structure. When she could not, everything else fell apart with it. The children experienced this as whether good days and bad days, loud nights and quiet mornings. A mother who could be the funniest person in the room and then, without warning, disappear behind a closed door. They loved her through all of it, and that love was real and specific, and it would shape everything that came after. The version of Judy Garland that exists in public memory is mostly the extremes. The voice that could stop a room, the collapses that made headlines, the comebacks, the marriages, the medication. Her children knew a different person, not a simpler one, but more complete one, a woman who existed in the hours between performances and the crises. Lorna would say, years later, that people would love her mother to be unloved and tragic, but she was not. It is not a daughter denying what happened. It is a daughter refusing to let what happened be the only thing that counted. Judy could be, by every account her children have given, genuinely funny. Not performing funny, but the kind of funny that made her children laugh at the dinner table. Liza, at 80, was still telling interviewers that the thing most people did not know about her mother was her humor. Not the voice, not the tragedy, the humor. There were also days that were not good. Liza described a childhood that contained both. Days when Mama was present, warm, and entirely herself, and days when she would not come out of her room. The children learned to read those signals early. The quality of the morning, the sound of the house, because they needed to know which kind of day was coming. There is a story Lorna has told about being 4 years old and watching The Wizard of Oz on television for the first time. Judy was in New York. Lorna was in Los Angeles with her siblings and their nanny. When the flying monkeys carried Dorothy away, Lorna became convinced they had taken her mother to New York. Judy called during the broadcast expecting to hear excitement and instead found her daughter in tears. She promised that Lorna would never have to watch the film without her again, and according to Lorna, she kept that promise. It is one of the clearest moments in the public record where Judy is visible not as a legend or a patient, but simply as a mother responding to her frightened child. In London in 1960, a photographer captured Lorna and Joey kissing their mother. Two small children leaning in, the kind of physical affection that millions of families produce every day. For this family, those photographs are among the few records of the ordinary warmth that existed alongside everything else. The children performed with Judy too, and those performances carry their own complicated weight. In 1967, Lorna and Joey appeared alongside their mother at the Palace Theater in New York for a run of 27 shows. Lorna was about 14. Joey was 12. They were old enough to understand that they were not just performing because their mother wanted company. The Palace engagement earned real money, and the money was needed. By closing night, federal tax agents had claimed a significant portion of the proceeds. A mother who could hold 27 audiences and still not hold on to the income long enough to keep it. A family that stood on stage together because it was both an act of love and an act of financial necessity. Her children never describe her with one verdict because their memories did not fit inside one. Liza put it this way in 2026, "Everybody has problems with their mother. It ain't just me. It sounds casual. It is a woman at the end of a very long road, refusing to let the public turn her family into a special category of suffering." What the children carried forward was not one memory, but two that could not be separated. The mother who was there and the mother who was not. Both lived in the same house. And both followed them into the years ahead, when the house itself was gone, and they each had to decide how much of their mother they were willing to share with the world that had always believed it owned her. The children were not only learning which version of their mother would appear each morning. They were beginning to learn what they had to do when she could not manage the day herself. Liza was 13 years old when the line between being Judy Garland's daughter and being Judy Garland's caregiver disappeared. In her 2026 memoir, she described what her life looked like at that age. She was, in her own words, her mother's nurse, doctor, pharmacologist, and psychiatrist rolled into one. She called doctors to ask about prescriptions. She monitored Judy's condition. She made decisions about when to intervene and when to step back. She did this not because someone had formally assigned her the job, but because she was there, and because someone had to do it, and because no one else in the room was going to. She was 13. Other 13-year-olds were arguing about curfew and learning how to be awkward. Liza was learning how to talk to a doctor on the phone about her mother's medication. She was learning to read the signs, which kind of day it was, how much intervention was needed, whether the situation could be handled inside the house or whether outside help was required. She later said the experience taught her patience and how to truly listen. She said she had been a comfort to her mother. A child can develop real compassion through caregiving and still have been placed in a position no child belongs in. Lorna's version of the same crossing was different in its details, but followed the same structure. Her father, Sid Luft, taught her how to handle Judy's medication. He showed teenage Lorna how to dilute certain pills with sugar, a method he used to manage Judy's intake, without her fully realizing the dosage had been reduced. Lorna has spoken about this publicly, without drama, in the tone of someone describing what was simply the way things worked in her household. When one parent teaches a teenager to manage another parent's medication, the child does not immediately recognize it as abnormal. It is just what the family does. The recognition comes later, sometimes years later, sometimes in a conversation where the question is asked in a way that makes the strangeness suddenly visible. Lorna described the highs and lows of living with Judy's dependency with a sentence that holds the experience without simplifying it. The highs were incredibly high and the lows were devastating. She also made sure to add that addiction was only part of the story. Not the whole story. Part of it. What made the caregiving harder was that it did not stay in one place. Judy's touring life did not pause for her children's stability. It could not. The engagements were how the money came in, and the money was always needed. So the children traveled. Hotels became temporary addresses. Schools changed. Routines dissolved and reformed around the next city, the next theater, the next show. Liza and Joey had chosen the road over staying behind in Los Angeles. But whatever choices the children were offered were choices made inside an adult crisis, with consequences they were too young to measure. And the responsibilities they carried on that road were not ordinary travel inconveniences. They were watching their mother's condition, adjusting their behavior to match her state, and managing situations that would have overwhelmed many adults. And then, in 1965, something shifted between Judy and Liza that was different from the caregiving and the traveling and the daily management. Liza was 18. She and Judy were performing together at the London Palladium. Liza was a performer by now, a real one, with talent that was becoming impossible to dismiss as inheritance. And during that engagement, Liza heard something she was not supposed to hear. Judy said to someone involved in the production that she wanted Liza removed from the show. Liza described that night as the moment she stopped being Mama's daughter and became another performer sharing a stage with Judy Garland. The moment changed how she understood the stage they shared. It was no longer only a place where mother and daughter came together. It could also be a place where the relationship turned into rivalry. A mother who had spent years relying on her oldest daughter as nurse, pharmacist, and anchor was now reacting to that same daughter as another performer on the bill. That did not define the rest of their relationship. Judy and Liza continued to have good days and hard days, warmth and distance, the complicated negotiation their bond had always been. But the Palladium night revealed a tension that had never been visible in quite the same way before. Care and competition could exist inside the same relationship, and the stage that had always brought the family together could also divide them. Lorna and Joey did not have that specific rupture. Their relationship with Judy in the later years was shaped more by the logistics of survival, the touring, the financial pressure, the daily work of keeping the household going. But they were carrying their own weight. Lorna, who was closer in age to Joey than to Liza, shared the daily reality of the Luft household more directly with her brother than with her older half-sister. They were together on the road, together backstage, together in the rooms where their mother's condition was visible and the adult's ability to manage it was inconsistent. By the late 1960s, Judy's health, finances, and personal life were becoming harder to sustain. She had married for the 5th time to Mickey Deans in March of 1969. The marriage looked, from the outside, like another attempt to start over. From the inside, the children could see what starting over looked like by then. It looked tired. It looked like London, a small rented space, a woman whose voice could still fill a hall, but whose body was running out of the ability to carry her there. 3 months after the wedding, on a Sunday morning in June, the starting over stopped. On June 22, 1969, a Sunday, Mickey Deans climbed to the window of a locked bathroom in their London home on Cadogan Lane. He found Judy inside. She was not conscious. She was 47 years old. She did not survive. The coroner, Dar. Gavin Thurston, ruled the death an accidental overdose of barbiturates. He found no evidence that it had been intentional. She had been married to Deans for roughly 3 months. Liza was in the United States. She was 23. Lorna was 16. Joey was 14. There is no public record detailed enough to reconstruct how each of them learned the news. What is known is what followed. Liza, who had spent the last decade functioning as her mother's caregiver, suddenly became the head of what remained of the family. She did not step into that role gradually. One day, she was Judy Garland's eldest daughter. The next day, she was the person responsible for the funeral. the younger siblings, and the task of managing a grief that belonged to her privately and to the entire world publicly. She was 23, organizing a public funeral for the most famous entertainer of her generation, while also trying to figure out what would happen to a 16-year-old sister and a 14-year-old brother. Lorna and Joey's father, Sid Luft, was still alive and would remain part of their lives, but his relationship with the family had been complicated by years of entanglement with Judy's career and finances. The practical reality of who would care for two teenagers, where they would live, and how they would be supported was not something the public mourning addressed or the headlines mentioned. That distinction matters. Liza did not become the legal parent of Lorna and Joey, and Sid did not vanish from their lives. But emotionally, Liza felt the center of gravity shift toward her. She was the oldest child, the best-known child, and the one who had already spent years being called when Judy was in trouble. Death did not end that pattern. It widened it. The calls were no longer about how to get Mama through the night. They were about funeral decisions, public statements, younger siblings, and the question of how a family built around one enormous personality was supposed to function after that personality was gone. For Lorna and Joey, the public ceremony could not answer the private questions. The crowds would eventually leave Madison Avenue. The flowers would be removed. Reporters would turn toward the next story. But they were still teenagers whose routines had already been unstable before the death. Now, even the possibility that Judy might return, recover, book another engagement, or gather everyone into another temporary household had disappeared. However difficult life with her had been, it had always moved around the expectation that she would come back into the room. After June 1969, there would be no next return. The siblings also entered grief from different positions. Liza was old enough to be assigned responsibility. Lorna was old enough to understand much of what had happened, but too young to control the decisions around her. Joey was younger still, and the public record preserves far less of what those first months felt like to him. The same death arrived as three different events: a burden of leadership, an abrupt end to adolescence, and a loss that the youngest child would spend the rest of his life discussing only on carefully chosen terms. The funeral was held at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home in Manhattan. Approximately 20,000 people lined up along Madison Avenue, waiting to file past the coffin of a woman most of them had never met but felt they knew. Her death felt personal to strangers in a way that very few deaths do. She was not a president. She was a voice and a face and a story that people had been following since she was a child. But inside that public mourning, 3 children were trying to bury their mother. Not a legend, not the girl who sang Over the Rainbow. Their mother, the woman who had been funny at the dinner table and absent behind a closed door, who had put them on stages and taken them on the road, whose medication they had learned to manage before they were old enough to drive. 20,000 people mourned Judy Garland. Liza, Lorna, and Joey mourned Mama. And the practical reality of what Judy left behind made the loss sharper. Despite decades of performing, concert tours, television specials, film roles, recordings, her estate was valued, by widely cited estimates, at roughly $40,000. The number is so small relative to what she had earned across her career that it reads like a mistake. The answer, as best as public accounts can reconstruct it, involves years of mismanagement, legal disputes, tax debts, and the financial vulnerability of a performer whose income depended entirely on her ability to keep appearing. The children did not inherit wealth. They did not inherit the kind of cushion that might have let them step out of the public eye and quietly rebuild. What they inherited was a legacy. The weight of being Judy Garland's children in a world that would never stop asking them about her, never stop comparing them to her, and never stop using her story to examine theirs. The imbalance was sharp. Studios, theaters, record labels, managers, and audiences had all profited from the work Judy began as a child. Yet when the machinery stopped, her children were left with debts, disputed accounts, and a legacy worth far more in public fascination than in financial security. They could not simply be adults with a famous parent who had died. They became custodians of a story they had not written and could never fully leave. All three children inherited the legend of Judy Garland. What they did not inherit was the same memory of their mother. Liza later connected the weeks after Judy's death to the beginning of her own struggles with dependency. She described taking her first Valium during that period, a pill to manage the unmanageable, and she would later call the pattern that followed something like a genetic inheritance from Mama. She said it not as a medical claim, but as a daughter recognizing years later that the things she had spent her childhood managing in her mother had found its way into her own body. The public moved on. The funeral ended. The headlines faded. Judy Garland became a fixed point in cultural memory. The three children she left behind became, in the public imagination, supporting characters in someone else's story. They were not supporting characters. They were the ones who had to keep living. Of the three, Liza was the first forced to answer what came next. She was already a performer, already a caregiver, and now, at 23, the eldest person left standing at the center of the family. Liza Minnelli did not wait for permission to become a performer. The stage had been part of her environment since before she could form memories. But her talent arrived inside a problem that would never fully go away. She was Judy Garland's daughter, and every audition, every review, every interview carried that fact with it. The comparison was not something she sought out. It was waiting in every room she entered. She was 19 when she won her first Tony Award for Flora the Red Menace in 1965. The same year, she stood on the London Palladium stage with Judy and heard her mother say she wanted her removed from the show. The two events described the exact territory Liza was navigating at 19. Good enough to win a national award on her own, and still her mother's daughter, still inside a relationship where love and competition had fused together. Then came cabaret. In 1972, Liza starred as Sally Bowles in Bob Fosse's film, and the performance created an identity so complete that it overwrote, at least temporarily, the one the public had assigned her. The Academy recognized it with the Oscar for Best Actress. She was 27. She had a Tony and an Oscar. She had separated herself from the legend, not by rejecting it, but by building something alongside it that was undeniably her own. The victory also carried the imprint of both parents without belonging completely to either one. From Judy came the emotional directness, the ability to make an audience feel that the performance was happening to her in real time. From Vincente came the precision of image, costume, movement, and frame. Liza's style was not Judy's style, even when reviewers insisted on placing them side by side. She used a family inheritance, but rearranged it into something sharper, stranger, and unmistakably her own. That did not stop interviewers from asking about Judy. Winning an Oscar did not free her from the comparison any more than winning a Tony had. In some ways, greater success made the questions more persistent. Every triumph produced another version of the same headline. Judy Garland's daughter had done it too. Liza could prove herself over and over, but she could not control the sentence people placed before her name. But the separation required constant maintenance. Year after year, role after role, the comparison returned. And the personal cost was not always visible from the outside. What became visible, eventually, was a pattern Liza herself would later connect to her mother's death. She had taken her first Valium in the weeks after Judy died, a pill to manage something that could not be managed any other way. She has been honest, decades later, about how that first pill became a longer story, one she described as feeling like a genetic inheritance from Mama. She was not making a medical claim. She was describing a recognition, the moment when a daughter who spent her childhood watching her mother's dependency realizes that the same pull is working on her own body. She fought it across years of work and relapse and treatment. Her career continued to the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond Broadway, film, television, concert halls around the world. She won a Golden Globe for Arthur. But the addiction was there, running underneath. Unlike her mother, Liza lived long enough to describe the pattern in her own words: seek treatment, return to work, and keep revising the story of what she had inherited. By early 2026, she was 79 years old, and in interviews connected to her memoir, she said plainly that she had been sober for 11 years. It was not a storybook victory, and she did not describe it as one. It was recovery measured across years of treatment, relapse, return, and a continued decision to tell the truth about what had happened. Throughout those decades, the relationship between Liza and her younger siblings remained more durable than the public might have assumed. She and Lorna came from different fathers, grew up in partially different households, and built entirely different public identities. But the shared experience of Judy, the caregiving, the loss, the legacy, kept them connected in ways that outlasted the differences. Lorna told reporters in 2025 that Liza was doing great and that they talked regularly. For a family whose internal life had been picked apart by the press for decades, a phone call between sisters was its own quiet achievement. Liza's role as the eldest never entirely disappeared. Even when the siblings were all well into adulthood, the old structure remained visible in small ways, and concerned past interviews and shared appearances, and in the assumption that news about one of them would eventually travel to the others. They did not build a public brand as the Garland children. Their bond survived more quietly than that, outside the machinery that had made their mother famous. Liza's memoir, Kids, Wait Till You Hear This, was published on March 10th, 2026. It was not a prosecution of Judy. It was a daughter deciding, at the end of a very long and very public life, exactly how much of the truth to share and in what order. She talked about MGM and what it had done to her mother. She talked about the caregiving, the Valium, the road. She talked about Judy's humor, which she still considered the most underreported part of her mother's character. On March 5th, 2026, she appeared at the GLAAD Media Awards at the Beverly Hilton, receiving the first Storyteller Award. She arrived in a wheelchair. Dancers introduced her. The room gave her a standing ovation. And the image of Liza Minnelli at 79, seated, celebrated, still present, was its own kind of answer to the question of what had become of Judy Garland's eldest child. She had told an interviewer that the hardest thing in her professional life had been getting to be known as myself as opposed to somebody's daughter. That sentence holds 60 years of work inside it. She also said something quieter. She said she still calls on her mother. That even now, Judy is not gone from her internal life. Not as a wound or a legend to be escaped, but as a presence she carries, the way anyone carries a parent who shaped them completely. At her wedding to Jack Haley Jr., years earlier, she had worn heels inspired by the ruby slippers. She did not wear them to be Judy. She wore them to bring Judy with her, on her own terms, into a life she had built for herself. Lorna Luft did not become as famous as her older sister. She did not win an Oscar or a Tony. She did not build the kind of career the public could point to as proof that the Garland legacy had produced another star of the same magnitude. What she built was something different. She became the family's narrator. In 1998, Lorna published me in My Shadows, a family memoir. The book put the inside of the Garland household on paper with a level of specificity that no interview or tribute concert had managed. It was not a prosecution of her mother, and it was not a defense. It was a portrait of a woman who was simultaneously extraordinary and impossible to live with, who gave her children real love and real instability on the same day. The book was later adapted into an ABC miniseries, Life with Judy Garland, Me and My Shadows, which won multiple Emmy Awards. The book became Lorna's answer to the version of Judy that had been reduced to addiction, tragedy, and cautionary headlines. By putting the painful parts beside the affectionate ones, she could protect neither her mother nor herself with a simple story. The public responded because the honesty felt unusually complete for a celebrity memoir. Turning the book into a television miniseries widened that responsibility. A memoir can remain inside one person's voice. A dramatization requires actors, scenes, reconstructed rooms, and decisions about which memories will become images for millions of viewers. Lorna was no longer only remembering her mother. She was helping shape the version another generation would see. The adaptation's success proved how hungry the public remained for Judy's private story, but also showed the risk Lorna had accepted. Once family memory becomes television, it no longer belongs entirely to the family. That may be why Lorna kept returning to interviews afterward, refining the message rather than assuming the book had settled it. She did not want the miniseries, the addiction, or even her own memories to become the final verdict. Her role was not to close the case on Judy Garland. It was to keep the picture from becoming too simple. What made the honesty distinctive was its refusal to simplify. Around the book's release, Lorna described forgiveness as the recognition that she had not caused her mother's illness and could not have saved her from it. That did not erase the harm. It changed the burden she believed she had to carry. Her mother had caused real pain, and her mother had also been caught inside forces larger than either of them. She carried that position through decades of appearances and interviews, and she carried it through her own body's crises. In 2012, Lorna was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent treatment and completed chemotherapy in 2013. She kept performing, including touring with Judy, the songbook of Judy Garland, because performing was how she earned a living, and because her relationship with her mother's catalog was practical as much as personal. She sang Judy's songs because they were great songs, because audiences wanted to hear them, and because singing them kept Judy present without pretending the presence was uncomplicated. In 2015, the cancer returned. Her UK tour had to end early. She came back to the United States for surgery. Then in 2018, while performing in London, Lorna collapsed and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. She had surgery that same month. She recovered. She kept going. Through all of it, she kept speaking about Judy. And what she said consistently was the same message in different words at different podiums and in different interviews. People would love my mother to be unloved and tragic, but she wasn't. The pain was real. The love was also real. The love does not get erased just because the pain makes a better headline. Lorna's relationship with Liza evolved quietly over the decades. They had different fathers, had spent parts of their childhood in different configurations of the family, and had built public identities on opposite ends of the visibility spectrum. But by 2025, Lorna was telling reporters they talked regularly. The dynamic was not dramatic or strained. It was two women in their 70s who had survived the same household and could still pick up the phone. And then Lorna did something that brought the whole family story into a single room. In late 2025, she walked into the Sphere in Las Vegas with her daughter Vanessa Jade O'Neill. On an enormous curved screen above them, a 16-year-old Judy appeared in a blue gingham dress. Lorna, now 73, said the experience of seeing her mother that young and that alive was overwhelming. Vanessa stood beside her, the granddaughter Judy never met, watching the grandmother she would only ever know as an image. On June 10th, 2026, what would have been Judy's 104th birthday, Lorna spoke again about why the Wizard of Oz still endured. She talked about home, the word that followed Judy from Dorothy's first song through every hotel, dressing room, and rented house that came afterward. For Lorna, home was never only a theme in a movie. It was a thing the family had spent decades trying to build, and the thing her children finally gave Judy in 2017 when they moved her for the last time. Joey Luff was 14 years old when his mother died. Liza was already an adult. Lorna was a teenager with enough years behind her to have formed detailed memories. Joey was the youngest, old enough to feel everything, too young to have had any say in how the household was organized or how the adults behaved inside it. He did not choose a road. He did not choose the stages. He did not choose to appear in his mother's projects at the age of 8, or to stand beside her at the Palace Theater at 12 while federal tax agents waited to claim the earnings. These things happened around him. And when Judy died in London, Joey was the one with the least power to shape what happened next. Liza became the family head. Lorna, at 16, was old enough to begin processing the loss in language she would later use publicly. Joey was 14. He buried his mother and then, by all available evidence, stepped back from the center of the story. It would be easy to write Joey Luft as the silent one, the child who disappeared because the family was too much. But the record does not support that reading. What it shows is something quieter and more deliberate. Joey did not pursue a career in front of cameras. He worked behind them, studying photography, learning sound, spending time on film sets and roles that did not require him to be recognized. He did not build a public identity around his mother's name. He did not write a memoir. He did not do the talk show circuit. He chose consistently to live at a lower volume than his sisters. That choice still kept him close to the world that had formed the family. Cameras, sound equipment, editing rooms, and sets were familiar territory. But behind the equipment, he could participate without becoming the object being watched. It was almost the reverse of his childhood, when he had been placed in front of audiences before he was old enough to decide whether he wanted them. As an adult, he could remain near the work while controlling the direction of the gaze. The distinction mattered. Liza answered the family legacy by becoming a star in her own right. Lorna answered it by turning memory into testimony. Joey did not need an equally public achievement to complete the pattern. His adult life suggested that survival could also look like refusing the role everyone expected you to play. But he did not disappear. In 1974, 5 years after Judy's death, Joey spoke to Mike Wallace. He was 19. He said, "I adored her as a mother, and then, mostly what I remember are the good times. Whether that came from temperament, from privacy, or from a different way of processing grief, Joey rarely explained. He simply held the line. 40 years later, he was still holding it. In 2014, he put together a presentation at the Pasadena Playhouse, a Judy Garland concert with Joey Luft. It was not a traditional one-man show. It used archival footage of Judy's performances, combined with Joey's own narration and personal stories. He wanted audiences to see the woman he remembered, not the version the tabloids had built. He told the Los Angeles Times, "People know the Wizard of Oz, but they don't necessarily know who Judy Garland really was." And he added, "I don't want to talk about the bad things." Then he said what he did want to talk about. She was a performer. She was a mother. She had the greatest sense of humor. Performer, mother, humor. The same 3 words Liza used. The same territory Lorna covered in her longer, more detailed public accounts. Joey arrived at the same destination as his sisters, but by a completely different route. Where Liza separated herself from the legend and built an independent career, and where Lorna opened a family archive and laid the complicated truth out in full, Joey's public choices suggest a boundary. He would speak about Judy as a performer and a mother. He would share the memories that mattered to him. He would not let the worst moments become the only price of admission. In a family where privacy had been stripped away by fame, tabloid coverage, and decades of public consumption of Judy's story, a boundary was one of the most valuable things a person could build. On March 2nd, 2014, all 3 of Judy's children appeared together at the Oscars for a tribute marking the 75th anniversary of The Wizard of Oz. It was one of the rare occasions when Liza, Lorna, and Joey stood in the same public frame, connected to the same memory. They were not arguing about their mother. They were not offering competing versions. They were there together, honoring what she had made. Joey did not need to turn the occasion into another account of what had gone wrong. His presence placed him beside his sisters and beside the part of Judy's life they could all honor together. He was 14 when he lost his mother. He is now in his 70s. The public record of his life between those 2 points is thin, not because he failed, but because he chose not to make his grief or his mother's worst moments into material for public consumption. He remembered her within the boundaries he set. And in a family where control had been in short supply since before any of them were born, that choice may be the quietest and most deliberate thing any of Judy Garland's children ever did. The 3 siblings did not arrive at the same public version of Judy, and they did not need to. What connected them was not agreement on every memory. It was recognition. Each understood what it meant to have strangers treat their mother as public property. Each knew the difference between Judy Garland and Mama. And when they appeared together, as they did at the 2014 Oscars, the importance was not that they had solved a family story. It was that 3 people who had carried it separately could still stand in the same frame. For most of her life, Judy Garland did not stay anywhere for long. She was born in a small Minnesota town and moved to California because her family needed to be closer to the industry. She was placed inside a studio at 13 and spent the next 3 decades moving between sound stages, concert halls, hotel rooms, husbands, and cities. She raised 3 children on the road, in dressing rooms, in temporary apartments that changed when the engagement ended or the marriage did. When she died in London in 1969, she was in a rented house. She was 47. Her children were 23, 16, and 14. And the question of where she would rest was not theirs to answer. Mickey Deans, her 5th husband of 3 months, handled the arrangements. The children, Liza barely an adult, Lorna and Joey still minors, had no meaningful say in what happened next. Judy was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. A spokesperson for Hollywood Forever Cemetery would later confirm that when Judy died, her children had no voice in the decision. The 1969 arrangements were made without them. She stayed there for nearly 50 years. In the decades between the funeral and what came next, the 3 children built their separate lives. Liza won her Oscar, fought her addiction, and spent 60 years insisting on being known as herself. Lorna wrote the book, survived the diagnoses, and kept telling the world that her mother was more than a tragedy. Joey worked quietly, remembered selectively, and refused to let the worst parts of the story define the woman he loved. They did not always occupy the same public space, but they remained connected by phone, by shared appearances at Judy-related events, and by the simple fact that no one else alive understood what it had been like to grow up inside that household. Then, in January 2017, they did something together. They moved their mother. After years of family discussion, Liza, Lorna, and Joey agreed to have Judy's remains transferred from Ferncliff to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. They brought her to the city where she had become who she was. They brought her to Southern California, where all 3 of them lived, so that she would be near them. The transfer was followed by a memorial service, attended by the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a family gathering far removed from the public viewing that had drawn 20,000 strangers in 1969. This time the family was not standing inside a national spectacle it had been too young to control. The people gathered were the generations that had come after Judy, including descendants she had never lived to meet, brought together by a decision her children had finally been old enough to make for themselves. The family publicly thanked the fans who had continued to love her. That gratitude did not surrender the decision back to the audience. It acknowledged that Judy had always belonged, in different ways, to both groups, to the millions who had carried her voice, and to the children who had carried the consequences of the life behind it. They could not choose for her in 1969. In 2017, they could. It did not make their memories identical. and it did not resolve what had happened inside the family. Liza still carried the comparison, the sobriety, and the mother she still called on inside herself. Lorna still carried the book, the diagnoses, and the insistence that Judy deserved the full truth rather than the simple version. Joey still carried the boundary and the quiet and the love he had never been willing to put on display. But for the first time, the decision about where Judy Garland would rest belonged to her children. Not a studio, not a husband, not an audience. Her children. She is there now, in Hollywood, near her children. It is not the place over the rainbow, and it is not a resolution. It is just the place where the three people who loved her most finally got to say, "This is where you stay." Did this story change the way you see Judy Garland and the three children she left behind? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you are watching from tonight.